I thought I was alone in the bathroom, savoring a rare moment of peace. But when the door creaked open and I saw him standing there, my stepson, his wide eyes locking with mine, my heart stopped. Embarrassment burned through me as his gaze lingered, but it wasn't just shock in his expression. In that fleeting moment, everything changed, and I couldn't unsee it. Life in our home was always a delicate balance, and for the most part, I believed I had it under control. I was Meline, a devoted wife to Robert, and a stepmother to Caden, his 20-year-old son from a previous marriage. Robert and I had been married for 5 years, and although blending families came with its challenges, I had always made it my priority to create a safe and harmonious space. Robert, a hard-working businessman, was away more often than not, leaving me to manage the house and the lingering loneliness that his absences brought. I poured my energy into maintaining the routines of our lives, cooking, cleaning, organizing, and tried not to notice the growing void between us. He was loving in his own way, but his job always seemed to demand more of him than I could. Caden, on the other hand, was at that age where he straddled the line between adolescence and adulthood. He had moved back in for the summer after his second year of college. I'd always seen him as the reserved and polite young man I had helped raise, though he had a quiet intensity about him that made him difficult to read at times. The house felt fuller with him around, but it also highlighted the loneliness I felt when Robert wasn't there. There were moments when I caught myself looking at Caden, his easy charm, his thoughtfulness, and wondered how he had grown up so fast. I told myself it was maternal pride, the kind a stepmother might feel for a child she had seen blossom over the years. But deep down, I couldn't ignore how it made me question myself. I clung to the belief that our family was stable, unshakable. I thought we were immune to the chaos that could unravel the lives of others. Yet lately I had begun to notice subtle shifts in my own emotions, things I couldn't name but could feel creeping in during quiet moments. Moments when the laughter in our home felt forced, or when Caden's gaze lingered a second too long, leaving a faint warmth in its wake. I didn't realize it then, but the foundations of my carefully constructed life were beginning to crack. The morning after that unexpected encounter in the bathroom, I told myself to forget about it. It was a mistake, I whispered as I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair with mechanical precision. Yet no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't escape the memory of Caden's wide-eyed expression or the charged silence that had filled the space between us. I convinced myself it was embarrassment, on both our parts. He hadn't meant to walk in on me, and I had overreacted. That's all it was. But as the days passed, I began to notice things I had never paid attention to before. Caden was quieter than usual, his usual aloofness replaced by something else. Hesitation, maybe even discomfort. I wondered if he was avoiding me, or if I was just imagining it because of my own guilty conscience. At dinner, the tension was almost unbearable. Robert was his usual self, rattling on about a new client while scrolling through his phone. But Caden barely touched his food, his gaze fixed on his plate, refusing to look up. Every time his fork scraped against the porcelain, I felt a sharp pang of unease. Was he thinking about that moment too? Was it as unforgettable for him as it was for me? I told myself to focus on Robert, to lose myself in the mundane flow of conversation. But even as I laughed at his half-hearted jokes, I couldn't help but notice the way Caden's gaze flicked up when he thought I wasn't looking. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it sent a jolt through me each time. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, I heard his footsteps approach. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hall. "Do you need help with that?" he asked, his voice soft. The question itself was innocuous, but something about the way he asked it made my heart race. "No, I've got it," I replied quickly, my voice higher than usual. He lingered for a moment, his gaze steady, before nodding and walking away. As soon as he was gone, I sank onto the couch, clutching a pair of Robert's socks to my chest, as if they could somehow steady the trembling in my hands. I began to notice other things too. The way Caden would pass by just a little too close, his presence brushing against me like static electricity. The way his voice would soften when he addressed me, as though we were sharing a secret no one else could understand. It was maddening, this unspoken, invisible tension that neither of us seemed able to shake. And then there were the nights. Long after Robert had fallen asleep, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every interaction with Caden in agonizing detail. I told myself it was wrong to think about him this way, that he was my stepson, and I was his stepmother. But the harder I tried to suppress the thoughts, the stronger they seemed to become. I began to feel his presence everywhere. Even in the silence, when I was alone in the kitchen or folding towels in the bathroom, I could sense him. It was as if the air itself had changed, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. I couldn't name it. I didn't dare. But deep down, I knew the cracks in my carefully constructed life were widening. And as much as I wanted to blame him for the way my thoughts had shifted, I couldn't deny the truth. This was as much about me as it was about him. Something in me was changing, and I was powerless to stop it. The boundaries between us were blurring, and I wasn't sure when or how it had happened. Caden and I were careful around each other, too careful, as though every interaction was a tightrope we both feared to cross. But the unspoken tension that had been building was becoming harder to ignore. It seeped into every glance, every word, and every moment we found ourselves alone. One evening, Robert was away on another business trip, leaving the house quieter than usual. I sat in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over my legs and a glass of wine resting on the coffee table. An old movie played on the television, but I wasn't paying attention. My thoughts were far too tangled to focus on anything but the strange mix of guilt and curiosity that had taken root in me. I heard footsteps on the stairs and felt my heart quicken instinctively. Caden appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed and his casual t-shirt hanging loosely over his frame. He hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe as if debating whether to step in. "Can I join you?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Of course," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. I gestured to the other end of the couch, my pulse racing as he settled into the seat opposite me. The distance between us felt too small, the air charged with an almost suffocating tension. I told myself to focus on the movie, but I could feel his presence, the heat of it, like a magnet pulling me toward him. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the television. But then he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You seem different when he's not here," he said, his tone calm but laced with something I couldn't place. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the intensity in his gaze. "Different how?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Lighter," he said after a pause. "Happier, maybe. Like you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." I swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. His words caught me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. "That's not true," I said finally, though the words felt hollow even to me. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees as his eyes held mine. "I see you, Meline," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "I see how much you do, how hard you try to hold everything together. But you deserve to feel happy too. You deserve to have something for yourself." His words hit me like a tidal wave, breaking through the fragile walls I had built around myself. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, and I quickly looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't I?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. "I've seen the way he takes you for granted, the way you give, and he barely even notices." "Stop," I said, my voice breaking as I tried to suppress the emotions bubbling to the surface. "This isn't fair, Caden. You don't understand." "Then help me understand," he said, his voice raw with vulnerability. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a fleeting but deliberate gesture. The contact sent a shiver through me, leaving my skin tingling with an awareness I couldn't ignore. I should have pulled away. I should have told him to stop, to leave, to pretend this conversation never happened. But instead I stayed there, my hand trembling beneath his touch as my mind raced with a chaotic swirl of emotions I couldn't untangle. "This isn't right," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel either." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and inescapable. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow as I tried to summon the strength to end this, to push him away before it was too late. But the truth was I didn't want to. There was a part of me, a small, quiet part, that wanted to close the distance between us. That wanted to lean into the forbidden pull I felt every time I was near him. Before I could say anything, the faint chime of the grandfather clock broke the spell, grounding us both in the reality of the moment. I pulled my hand away, the loss of his touch leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. "I think you should go to bed," I said finally, my voice trembling but firm. Caden nodded, his expression unreadable as he rose to his feet. "Good night, Meline," he said, his voice soft. "Good night," I replied, though the word felt inadequate, too small to hold everything I was feeling. As he disappeared up the stairs, I sat there in the quiet of the living room, my heart racing and my mind replaying every word, every glance, every fleeting touch. I told myself this was the end, that I wouldn't let things go any further. But deep down I knew it wasn't true. The house was unnervingly quiet the next day, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel amplified. Robert had left early for another business trip, leaving me alone with Caden once again. I tried to focus on my daily tasks, folding laundry, tidying up the kitchen, but my mind was clouded with the weight of what had happened the night before. Every time I thought about his words, his touch, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't fully explain. Guilt, shame, and something far more dangerous, longing. By the afternoon, I was restless, unable to sit still. I decided to step out onto the porch, hoping the fresh air might clear my mind. The summer breeze carried with it the faint scent of the gardenias Robert had planted years ago, their delicate fragrance a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside me. I sipped my iced tea, staring out at the yard, but my thoughts were a tangled mess, each one pulling me further into a place I didn't want to go. The sound of the sliding glass door opening startled me, and I turned to see Caden stepping onto the porch. He held a beer in his hand, his casual demeanor masking the tension that hung between us. "Couldn't stay inside either?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes searching. "No," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some air." He nodded, stepping closer and leaning against the porch railing. For a while we stood there in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But the quiet between us wasn't peaceful. It was charged, every second stretching into an eternity. "You've been quiet today," he said finally, his tone casual but his gaze intense. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Just tired, I guess." "Meline," he said, his voice dropping to a softer, more serious tone. "You don't have to pretend with me." I turned to him, my chest tightening at the way he looked at me. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and it felt as though he could see straight through me, past all the walls I had carefully built to protect myself. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you do," he replied, stepping closer. "We can keep pretending this isn't happening, but we both know it is." "Caden, stop," I said, my voice trembling. This isn't right." "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him to leave, to put an end to this once and for all. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there frozen, as he reached out and gently took my hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and yet it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. "We can't do this," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew I didn't mean it. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you don't feel it, and I'll walk away." I couldn't. The truth hung heavy in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. I felt it, the pull, the connection, the forbidden temptation that had been building between us for weeks. And in that moment, I hated myself for it. But I couldn't deny it any longer. Before I could respond, the sound of a car door slamming broke the spell. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see Robert walking up the driveway, his briefcase in hand. He wasn't supposed to be back until the following evening. Panic surged through me as I pulled my hand away from Caden's, stepping back quickly as if putting physical distance between us could erase what had just happened. "Robert's home," I said, my voice shaking. Caden nodded, his jaw tightening as he stepped back as well. "We'll talk later," he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment before he turned and walked inside. I stood there, my heart racing, as Robert approached the porch. "Surprise," he said with a smile, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Thought I'd come back a day early and spend some time with my two favorite people." That's great," I replied, forcing a smile as I prayed he couldn't see the guilt written all over my face. The evening passed in a blur, with Robert completely oblivious to the tension that filled the air. At dinner, he chatted happily about his meetings while Caden and I avoided each other's gaze. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, every word, every gesture carefully measured to avoid drawing suspicion. But later that night, as I lay in bed beside Robert, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. The memory of Caden's touch, his words, his gaze, it was all too vivid, too real. I knew I had crossed a line, one I could never uncross. And I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I was startled awake in the middle of the night by the sound of voices downstairs. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I sat up and strained to listen, I realized it was real. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Robert, and crept down the stairs. As I reached the bottom, I froze. Caden and Robert were in the living room, their voices low but heated. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tension was palpable. I stayed hidden in the shadows, my heart pounding as I tried to piece together what was happening. And then I heard it. "Is there something going on between you and Meline?" Robert's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. How had he found out? Had Caden said something? Had I given something away? My mind raced with questions, but I didn't have any answers. Caden's response was calm, measured. "No, of course not. I don't know what you're talking about." But even as he denied it, I could hear the strain in his voice. And I knew Robert could too. For a long moment, there was silence. And then Robert spoke again, his tone colder this time. "Good. Because if I ever found out otherwise, there would be hell to pay." I crept back up the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me. As I slipped back into bed, I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew the secret we were keeping wasn't safe, not anymore. And I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The morning after Robert's confrontation with Caden, the air in the house was suffocating. It was as if the weight of unspoken words had taken on a life of its own, pressing down on every interaction, every glance. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, trying to drown out the echo of Robert's words. If I ever found out otherwise, there would be hell to pay. Caden stayed in his room for most of the morning, and when he did come downstairs, he avoided my gaze entirely. The boy who had once filled the house with his quiet confidence now seemed smaller, diminished, as though the weight of the situation had carved away pieces of him. Robert, on the other hand, acted as though nothing had happened. He kissed me on the forehead as he left for work, his usual travel bag slung over his shoulder, and smiled as he reminded me about a dinner party we were supposed to attend that weekend. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone light. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. My stomach churned as he leaned in for a kiss, the gesture now feeling hollow and strained. As soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath, leaning against the counter for support. I wasn't okay. None of us were. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found Caden sitting on the back porch, staring out at the yard with a beer in his hand. He didn't look up as I stepped outside, but I could feel the tension in his posture, the stiffness in his shoulders. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's there to talk about?" he replied, his tone flat. "Caden, please," I said, stepping closer. I need to know you're okay." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You're worried about me? What about you? What about him? Do you even realize what we've done?" I flinched at the sharpness in his voice. "I do," I said softly. "I realize it every second of every day. But we can't fall apart now. We have to move forward." "Move forward?" He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "How do we move forward from this? How do we pretend nothing happened?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But we have to try. For Robert's sake. For the sake of this family." His gaze softened slightly, but the pain remained. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice quiet now, almost vulnerable. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Did I regret it? Did I regret the way my heart raced every time he looked at me? The way his touch lingered long after he was gone? The way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years? "Yes," I said finally, though the word felt like a betrayal. "I regret it. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "I don't know if I can stay here," he said after a long pause. "Not like this." My chest tightened at his words. "You're leaving?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But maybe it's for the best. For both of us." The thought of him leaving was like a knife to my heart, but I knew he was right. Every day he stayed, the tension between us grew. The risk of Robert finding out became greater. And the guilt that weighed on me felt unbearable. That night, I told Robert that Caden had mentioned wanting to move back to campus early. "It's probably better for him to focus on his studies," I said, keeping my voice casual. Robert barely looked up from his laptop. "If that's what he wants," he said, "it's probably for the best. He's an adult now. He needs to make his own decisions." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll help him pack." The next morning, I found Caden in the kitchen, his bags already packed and sitting by the door. He was dressed in his usual casual clothes, but there was a heaviness in his expression that made my chest ache. "So this is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. "This is it," he replied, forcing a faint smile. "Maybe it's better this way." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I'll miss you," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I'll miss you too," he said softly. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the space between us filled with all the things we couldn't say. And then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a fleeting, deliberate gesture. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice barely audible. "You too," I whispered. And just like that, he was gone. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house, leaving a silence that felt heavier than any noise. Over the next few days, I threw myself into routine, trying to fill the void his absence had left. Robert didn't seem to notice the change in me. He was too busy with work, as always. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I couldn't escape the memory of Caden. The way he had looked at me. The way he had made me feel. The fallout of what we had done was something I would carry with me forever. It had changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. And though I knew I would never see him the same way again, I also knew I would never forget him. Because some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The weeks after Caden left felt like walking through a fog. The house seemed emptier, quieter, too quiet. Robert noticed my distant behavior but attributed it to stress, as he often did. "You need to relax more," he would say, offering solutions that felt as detached as he was. I nodded along, forcing a smile, because I couldn't give him the truth. The truth would destroy him, and everything else we had built. I poured myself into the routines of daily life. I cooked elaborate meals, cleaned until every corner of the house gleamed, and even took up gardening, something I had always told myself I didn't have time for. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories lingered. They slipped into my thoughts at the most unexpected times, while folding laundry, while stirring a pot of soup, while lying in bed beside Robert. They were like shadows, always there, even when I tried to push them away. I told myself I had learned my lesson, that what had happened with Caden was a wake-up call, a reminder of how fragile my life truly was. But even as I tried to find peace, I couldn't shake the guilt. It wasn't just the betrayal of Robert or the impropriety of what had happened. It was the realization that I had let myself become so lost, so disconnected, that I had been vulnerable to something I should have seen coming. One afternoon, while tending to the garden, I found myself reflecting on how I had ended up here. When had things with Robert begun to shift? When had the love and connection we once shared been replaced by routine and distance? I couldn't pinpoint the moment, but I knew it had been a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. And instead of confronting it, I had let it happen, telling myself that this was what marriage looked like. That it was normal. But it wasn't normal, not for me. And maybe that was the real lesson. That I had ignored my own needs for so long, I hadn't even recognized myself anymore. Caden wasn't the cause of my discontent. He was just a symptom of it, a mirror reflecting back the parts of myself I had tried to bury. That evening, I sat down with Robert, determined to have the conversation I had avoided for so long. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the anxiety tightening in my chest. He looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed in confusion. "About what?" "About us," I said. "About how we've been living like strangers under the same roof. About how I feel like I'm losing myself in this marriage." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might brush it off, tell me I was overreacting. But then he set his laptop aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said quietly. "Because I never told you," I admitted. "I thought if I just kept going, if I just held everything together, it would get better. But it hasn't. For the first time in years we talked. Really talked. About the distance between us, about his work and how it had consumed so much of his life, about my loneliness and the growing emptiness I had felt. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't fix everything. But it was a start. In the weeks that followed, we both made changes. Robert began making more time for us, cutting back on his travel, and being more present. I started focusing on myself again, on my interests, my passions, the things that made me feel alive. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull me under. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. I never told Robert the truth about Caden. Some secrets, I decided, were better left buried. But I knew I would carry the weight of it with me forever, a reminder of the line I had crossed and the lessons it had taught me. In the end, I realized that betrayal doesn't just happen in a moment. It's a slow unraveling, a series of choices that lead you further and further away from the person you want to be. And while I couldn't undo what had happened, I could choose to be better moving forward. To be honest, not just with Robert, but with myself. Because no matter how tempting it might be to bury the truth, the cost of living a lie is far greater. And in the quiet moments, when the weight of my choices felt unbearable, I reminded myself of one thing. Redemption isn't about erasing your mistakes. It's about learning from them and choosing to do better. What would you do if you found yourself in her position? Could you confront the cracks in your own life before it's too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who loves compelling drama. And stay tuned. Our next story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and betrayal.